For 11 months, Caleb Whitfield bought bread every single market day, more loaves than one man could eat in a year, more than his horses could finish as scraps. The whole town thought he simply had a taste for Addie Freeman's baking. Only Caleb knew the truth. He wasn't buying bread. He was buying 30 seconds, in which the only woman he'd let himself think about in 3 years would look up, hand him his change, and say his name like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He would have paid far more than a nickel a loaf to keep hearing it. He came down from his ranch at the edge of town before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, his horse's breath fogging in the cool Wyoming air. He tied off at the same post every week, the leather worn smooth from a year's worth of habit. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders from years of fence work and breaking horses, with a quiet face that gave little away. Folks in Millbrook knew him as reliable fare in his dealings, and not much for conversation. What they didn't know, what he made certain they didn't know, was why he walked every single Thursday directly to the bread stall at the corner of 2nd and Elm. Thursday mornings in Millbrook arrived the same way they had for as long as anyone could remember, with the low creak of wagon wheels rolling in from the outlying ranches, the smell of wood smoke curling up from the blacksmith's forge, and the particular hush that settled over the town square before the market truly woke. Caleb Whitfield was always among the first to arrive. Addie Freeman's stall was easy to find. The smell alone guided a man there. Yeast and browned crust, and something faintly sweet like molasses worked into the crumb. She had inherited the recipes from her mother, along with the small clapboard building behind the stall where she did her baking, before dawn. She was 27, though grief and responsibility had given her the steadiness of someone older. 3 years a widow, she ran the stall herself, raised her son herself, and asked for help from no one. It was not pride exactly. It was closer to armor. Caleb reached the stall and set down 2 coins before she'd even finished wrapping the loaf a nickel, and beside it deliberately placed a single penny. "That's a penny more than the bread costs, Mr. Whitfield." Addie said the way she said it every week, her tone somewhere between amusement and genuine puzzlement. "Keep it," he said, the way he always did. "For the trouble." "It's no trouble to sell bread." He didn't answer that. He never did. He only nodded, took the loaf, and let his eyes rest on her face for exactly as long as it took her to say his name, which she did, now handing him his change he refused to take. "Have a good week, Mr. Whitfield." Something in him settled at the sound of it, the same way it did every Thursday, the same way it had for 11 months now. He was not a man who examined his own feelings closely, but even he could not fail to notice that he bought more bread than any bachelor rightly needed, and that he always seemed to find a reason to be in the square precisely when her stall opened. He didn't stay to think on it. He never did. He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go. "Nathaniel," she called, "let Mr. Whitfield get on with his day." "He doesn't mind," Nathaniel said with the absolute certainty of a child. "I don't mind," Caleb echoed, and there was almost a smile in it, the ghost of one gone as quickly as it came. "Left him home today," Caleb said, crouching down slightly so he wasn't looming over the boy. "He's got a sore hoof, needs his rest." "Will he get better?" "He will. Just needs patience is all. Same as most things." Addie watched this exchange from behind her stall, a loaf half wrapped in her hands, forgotten. It was not the first time she'd seen Caleb speak with her son, but something about the ease of it struck her freshly this morning. Nathaniel did not warm easily to strangers. He'd learned the way children of widows sometimes learn too early, to be careful of who he let close. And yet here he was, tugging on the sleeve of a man who bought bread and said little else. That was when a small voice stopped him. "Mr. Caleb." Nathaniel came barreling around the side of the stall, 6 years old, and entirely without the caution his mother wished he'd learned. He skidded to a stop in front of Caleb's boots, grinning up at him, with the gap-toothed confidence of a boy who had decided somewhere along the way that this quiet rancher belonged to him. "Did you bring Samson?" the boy asked, meaning the old gelding Caleb sometimes rode into town. She didn't examine what it meant. She had a stall to run a son, to feed a life built carefully around not needing anyone. But as she wrapped the next customer's loaf, her mind stayed a moment longer than it should have on the sound of her own name in his low, quiet voice. How ordinary he made it sound, and how she found herself lately listening for it. He straightened, touched his hat brim again, this time to both of them, and walked back toward his horse. Addie's eyes followed him a moment longer than she meant them to. She noticed the set of his shoulders, the unhurried way he moved through a crowd, without ever quite being part of it. She noticed, too, the faint tremor in his hand when he'd set down the coins, so slight she might have imagined it, except she hadn't. She'd seen it before. Almost every week, if she was honest with herself. It was during the lull after the rush, when the square quieted into its afternoon rhythm, that Louise Caro ambled over from her fabric stall, 2 rows down, wiping her hands on her apron, and wearing the particular expression she got when she'd been doing arithmetic in her head. "Addie Freeman," she said, planting herself against the stall counter. "How many loaves did that man buy today?" "Which man?" "He runs a ranch with 2 hired hands who eat their own cooking, and a house with 1 mouth in it besides his own." Louise crossed her arms. "I counted Addie. Near on 60 loaves since spring. That's not hunger. That's a man finding an excuse to stand in front of a woman once a week. You're imagining things." By mid-morning, the market had filled in properly, wagons lined 3 deep along the square, the blacksmith's hammer ringing steady counterpoint to the calls of vendors hawking eggs, tallow candles, bolts of gingham. Addie's stall had its usual midweek rush, and she moved through it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this every Thursday for 3 years running. Louise gave her a look that suggested she knew exactly which man, and that the question hadn't fooled her for a moment. "Caleb Whitfield. I've been keeping half an eye on your ledger these last months, whenever you let me near it, and I'll tell you plainly, no bachelor eats that much bread." Addie busied herself straightening the loaves that didn't need straightening. "He runs a ranch, Louise. Ranch work makes a man hungry." Louise softened some of the teasing going out of her voice. "I'm not saying it to embarrass you. I'm saying it because I've watched you carry this stall and that boy on your own back for 3 years, and I don't think you've let yourself notice what's right in front of you. There's nothing to notice. He buys bread, I sell it. And the penny—" Addie looked. She hadn't meant to keep such careful track. The ledger was for her accounts, nothing more, but there it was laid out, in her own handwriting, undeniable. She felt heat rise in her face and hated that it did. "He's a good customer," she said finally, which was true and also entirely beside the point. "I'm counting things. There's a difference." Louise reached over and flipped open the small ledger Addie kept tucked beneath the counter, running her finger down the column of Thursday entries, the same customer name week after week, the quantities creeping steadily upward since the previous autumn. She turned the book so Addie could see it plainly. "Look at that and tell me I'm imagining it." But lying in the dark, she found herself doing the arithmetic anyway, not of bread, but of moments. The way he crouched to speak to Nathaniel at the boy's own height. The way his eyes found hers before his hands found his coin purse every single week, as though the bread were only ever the excuse. The way she had, without noticing, when it started, begun listening for the particular sound of his footsteps among the market's morning din. Addie's hand stilled on the loaf she was wrapping. She hadn't told Louise about the penny, hadn't told anyone. Louise must have seen it herself some Thursday, when she wasn't paying close enough attention to hide it. "It's for the trouble," Addie said, echoing Caleb's own words without quite meaning to. Hmm, Louise said, entirely unconvinced, and let the matter drop for now. She had learned over years of friendship when to press, and when to let a seed sit and do its own quiet work. Addie closed the ledger and set it back beneath the counter, but the numbers stayed with her the rest of the afternoon, resurfacing at odd moments, while she kneaded the next morning's dough, while she watched Nathaniel chase the Hutchins boy around the well pump, while she lay awake later that night, listening to the wind work at the shutters. 60 loaves. Near a year of Thursdays. She had never once let herself count them, had told herself there was nothing there worth counting. Saturday brought a scare that had nothing to do with bread or coins or the careful distance Addie and Caleb kept between them. It brought Nathaniel running through the square, breathless, his small face pale with the particular panic only a lost dog can produce. "Biscuit's gone," he said, tugging at his mother's skirt outside the mercantile. "He got out under the fence and I can't find him nowhere." She turned onto her side, frowning at nothing in the darkness. It was a foolish thing to lie awake over. She had built a life that did not require a man's attention, had built it carefully, brick by brick, in the years since Thomas Freeman had been carried out of the mine on a plank and never carried anywhere again. She did not need Caleb Whitfield's pennies, or his patience with her son, or the particular quiet way he said nothing at all. And yet the question Louise had planted would not leave her be small and stubborn as a burr caught in wool. Why him? Why every week? Why does he keep coming back? She did not have an answer, but for the first time in 3 years, she found she wanted one. They found Caleb in the yard behind his barn, forking hay into the stalls, and it was there near the woodpile at the far corner of the property that they finally heard a thin, frightened bark. Addie crouched to his level, smoothing back the hair that had fallen into his eyes. "He's probably chasing a rabbit somewhere close, love. We'll find him." But an hour of searching the square and the alleys behind the church turned up nothing, and Nathaniel's chin had begun to tremble in the way that meant tears weren't far off. It was Widow Hutchins sorting dried lavender at her stall, who suggested they try the Whitfield ranch. The boy had followed the dog that direction before chasing after Caleb's wagon more than once. It took the better part of 10 minutes. Nathaniel grew restless twice and had to be gently hushed. But eventually, the dog's trembling eased, and it crept forward inch by inch until it finally pressed its nose into Caleb's waiting palm and let itself be drawn out. "There he is," Caleb said, and handed the shaking animal into Nathaniel's arms, as though it were the most natural transaction in the world. "Under there," Caleb said, already moving before Addie had finished explaining. Biscuit had wedged himself deep into a gap between 2 stacked cords of split wood, too frightened by his own predicament to simply back out the way he'd come. Nathaniel dropped to his knees in the dirt, calling the dog's name, but the animal only pressed itself further into the gap, trembling. Caleb didn't rush it. He crouched down slow the way Addie had noticed he did most things, and made a low, steady sound in his throat, not quite words. Just a patient, unhurried murmur, the same tone she'd heard him use on skittish horses in the corral beyond the barn. He held out one open hand, palm up, and waited. He walked them partway back toward the road, and along the way, Nathaniel chattered about the old gelding they passed in the near pasture, the same Samson he'd asked after on Thursday, favoring one back leg as he grazed. "Is he better?" Nathaniel asked. "Getting there," Caleb said. "Had the farrier out twice already. These things take time. Can't rush a hoof any more than you can rush most things worth doing right." Nathaniel buried his face in the dog's fur, muttering relieved nonsense to it. And Addie found herself watching Caleb instead, the unhurried patience of him, the way he'd known exactly how much space to give a frightened creature, and exactly when to close it. "You're good with him," she said. "Biscuit, I mean. And Nathaniel." Caleb shrugged, wiping his hands on his trousers as he stood. "Animals aren't so different from people." Most creatures just need to know you're not going to grab for them before they'll come close on their own. It was, she thought, the longest sentence she'd heard him say that didn't involve the price of bread. But she had seen something in Caleb Whitfield that afternoon she hadn't let herself look at squarely before, a man patient enough to wait out a frightened dog, gentle enough that her guarded son trusted him without question, careful enough with his own words that she suspected he was hiding something behind them. She did not know what to do with the thought. So she finished her tea, banked the fire, and told herself she would think no more of it. She thought of little else. Addie glanced at him, wondering if he heard the echo in his own words, the same philosophy he seemed to apply to fences, to horses, to Thursday mornings, and pennies left uncollected. She said nothing of it, but she carried the thought home with her, turning it over the way Louise's arithmetic still turned in the back of her mind. That evening, after Nathaniel had been bathed and put to bed with Biscuit curled at his feet, Addie sat on her own small porch, with a cup of tea gone lukewarm in her hands, and allowed herself briefly to admit what she had been circling for days. She had built her life to need no one. She had told herself that steadiness running her stall, raising her boy, keeping her books balanced to the penny, was enough of a life for any woman who had already buried the love she'd been given once. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, drawing up beside her with his hat already in hand, "I wonder if you'd permit me to walk you and the boy home this afternoon. Been meaning to speak with you a while now, if you'll have the time." He was, by any reasonable measure, an easy man to admire. He owned the largest spread east of the river, kept his boots polished even on a working day, and had a way of tipping his hat that made a woman feel singled out in a crowd. He was not unkind. He was, if anything, direct in a way Caleb never allowed himself to be. Sunday services at the Millbrook Presbyterian ran long that week. Reverend Whitcomb had taken it upon himself to preach at some length on the virtue of patience, a coincidence Louise found so amusing she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing outright, catching Addie's eye across the pew as she did. It was in the churchyard afterward, while the congregation lingered in small clusters beneath the cottonwoods, that Emmett Garrity made his approach. It was, Addie thought, a reasonable offer, plainly stated from a man of good standing and good intention. She should have felt something at hearing it, relief perhaps, or the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. Instead, she felt only a strange, hollow stillness, as though she were considering an offer made to someone else entirely. Addie hesitated only a moment. Before agreeing, it seemed a small enough kindness, and refusing outright would have drawn more attention than accepting. Nathaniel ran ahead with the Hutchins boy, and Garrity fell into an easy stride beside her, his conversation comfortable and unhurried, touching on the fine spring weather and the price of cattle, and eventually on the matter he'd apparently been building toward for weeks. "I'll speak plainly, Mrs. Freeman, since I've never been a man for circling a thing." He glanced at her, something careful in his confidence now. "You've built a fine life for yourself and your boy, and I admire that more than I can rightly say. I'd like your permission to call on you properly. I think we'd suit each other well, and I think that boy of yours could use a man's steady hand as he grows." He did not go over. He did not trust himself to say anything worth saying, not with the particular unsteadiness that had settled into him. So he stood by the hitching post and watched, and told himself it changed nothing, and knew, even as he thought it, that this was a lie. It did not help. Something in his chest had gone tight and cold the moment he'd seen Garrity fall into step beside her, and it did not loosen now, watching the two of them walk the churchyard path with Nathaniel darting ahead. From across the churchyard, close enough to see, but too far to hear, Caleb Whitfield stood near the hitching post, with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He had watched Garrity's new wagon roll up outside the bakery 3 days running now. He had heard, same as everyone in Millbrook heard everything eventually, that Garrity meant to make his intentions known. He told himself it was no business of his. He told himself this several times, in fact, with the same firm patience he applied to a green horse that hadn't yet learned to trust the bit. That night, after Nathaniel was asleep, she sat at her small kitchen table with a scrap of paper before her, trying to write out the reasons a woman ought to accept such an offer. Security, companionship for her son, an end to the particular exhaustion of doing everything alone. She could not, however, make herself write down the one word that kept surfacing beneath all the others, unbidden and unwelcome: Thursday. "I'd need to think on it," Addie told Garrity finally, which was truthful enough. She genuinely did not know her own mind. In that moment only that some part of her had gone quiet and watchful, waiting to see how she felt once the offer had settled. "Of course," Garrity said, easy as ever. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not a man in a hurry." He tipped his hat and left her at her gate, and Addie stood a moment in her own dooryard turning the conversation over. It was by every practical measure the sensible choice: a steady man, a good provider, a future for Nathaniel that did not depend on her own 2 hands holding up a bakery stall forever. She had spent 3 years telling herself that sensible was the only kind of choice worth making. She told herself it meant nothing. A man could have business elsewhere. A man could simply run out of reasons to keep a habit going. She thought of a nickel and a penny left uncollected, of a low voice saying her name, as though it cost him something to say it plainly, of a man patient enough to coax a frightened dog from a woodpile with nothing but stillness and an open hand. She folded the paper without finishing it, and told herself, not for the first time that week, that she would think no more of it. Thursday came, and for the first time in nearly a year, Caleb Whitfield did not walk into the Millbrook market. Addie noticed it before the church bell had even finished tolling the hour. She told herself she wasn't watching for him, even as her eyes kept drifting toward the road that came down from the ranches, even as she found reasons to linger near the front of her stall instead of the back, where the ovens needed tending. By mid-morning, when the square had filled and filled again with its usual Thursday rhythm, she could no longer pretend she hadn't noticed his absence. By the time she closed up for the day, folding the unsold loaves into her basket for the church poor box, she had to admit to herself quietly, and with no small amount of alarm, that she had spent the better part of a Thursday distracted by the absence of a man who bought bread he didn't need. "You've been somewhere else all morning," Louise observed, appearing at her elbow as Addie latched the stall's wooden shutter. "I've been right here." Addie knew none of this. She only knew that the stall across the way, where he usually tied his horse, stood empty, and that some small, stubborn part of her kept turning to look at it anyway, as though her looking might will him into appearing. The truth, had she known, it was less simple. 2 nights before, the one of Caleb's mares had come down with a fever that spread quick and ugly through the herd, and he had spent 3 sleepless nights moving between stalls with a lantern and a bottle of liniment, watching for the telltale signs the vet had warned him: to catch early heat in the legs, a cough that rattled too deep, a refusal to eat. He'd sent his hired hand for the veterinarian from the county seat, a thin, tired man who'd left behind a handwritten list of dosages and a warning that they weren't out of danger yet. Caleb had not left the barn in 2 days. He had not thought of bread or pennies or Thursday mornings, because he had not had room in himself to think of anything beyond the next hour and the next horse. Addie walked home slower than usual that evening, Nathaniel's hand in hers, the empty basket swinging from her other arm. She found herself doing the thing she'd sworn she wouldn't, turning the last 11 months over in her mind, like pages in a book she hadn't realized she'd been reading closely. The nickel and the penny, the way he crouched to speak to her son, the unhurried patience he'd shown a frightened dog wedged in a woodpile, the tremor in his hand she'd told herself she'd imagined, except she hadn't, not really. "You could start by admitting it's there," Louise said. "Rest tends to sort itself out after that, in my experience. Your hands have." The rest of you's been watching that empty hitching post since sunup." Louise's voice had none of its usual teasing in it now, only a gentleness that was somehow harder to bear. "You miss him." Addie opened her mouth to deny it, found she couldn't quite manage the lie, and closed it again. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted finally, the words coming out smaller than she meant them to. She did not sleep well. She told herself it was worry over nothing. She did not entirely believe it. The following Thursday, Caleb returned thinner around the eyes, a little more worn than usual, but present, his horse tied at the familiar post, and his boots carrying him to the familiar stall. He said nothing of the fever that had nearly taken half his herd, only that he'd been kept busy and set down his nickel and his penny, as though no week had passed between them at all. She thought of Emmett Garrity's offer plainly stated, and sensibly reasoned, still sitting unanswered. She thought of how easy it would be to say yes to a man who asked so directly for what he wanted, and how strange it was that the thought of doing so left her feeling nothing at all, while the mere absence of a quiet rancher who had never once asked her for anything had unsettled her entire day. That night, after Nathaniel was asleep, she stood at her window a long while looking out at the dark road that led toward the Whitfield ranch, though there was nothing to see but starlight on empty fields. Why does his not coming feel heavier than another man's coming, did she thought, and had no answer for herself. Only the quiet, uncomfortable certainty that she had let herself feel something she had spent 3 careful years making certain she would never feel again. Addie glanced at her, curious, despite herself. She had known Widow Hutchins her whole life, mostly as a fixture of the market, a quiet, steady presence who sold dried flowers and kept mostly to herself. She had never once heard the woman speak of a husband named Everett. "I didn't know you'd been married," Addie said. Addie noticed the tiredness in him, but didn't press. She noticed, too, the small, unguarded relief that rushed through her at the mere sight of him crossing the square, relief so plain and so sudden that it frightened her more than his absence had. It was Widow Hutchins at the flower stall beside her own who caught the look on Addie's face as Caleb walked away that morning. "You've got the same look my Everett used to put on my face," the old woman said, not unkindly, sorting dried lavender into small paper twists with hands gone soft and spotted with age, though it took me a good deal longer than a year to admit it out loud. She reached beneath her table and drew out a small wooden box, worn smooth at the corners, and opened it to show Addie a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a dozen or more, the paper yellowed and soft with age. "Never sent a one of them," Widow Hutchins said. "Wrote them after when it was too late to matter, just to say what I should have said when it might have. What happened? He went east, chasing better land, told himself he'd write for me once he'd settled and had something worth offering. And I let my pride keep me from writing first, from telling him it wasn't land I wanted." The old woman's hands stilled over the lavender, and for a moment something old and unhealed passed over her face. "He married a Kansas woman inside the year. I heard it secondhand, the way you hear most things that break your heart. I wasn't," Widow Hutchins said simply. "Everett Bowen courted me for the better part of 2 years, back before this town had half the buildings it does now. He was careful the way that man of yours is careful," she nodded toward the road Caleb had taken. "Always finding some errand that brought him past my father's place, never quite saying the thing he meant to say. And I was proud back then. Told myself a woman didn't chase after a man too shy to speak plain, no matter how her heart carried on about it." Addie carried the words with her the rest of the day, turning them over the way she'd turned over Louise's arithmetic and her own restless nights. She thought of Emmett Garrity's plain, sensible offer, still unanswered on her kitchen table in the form of an unfinished list of reasons. She thought of the particular hollowness she'd felt at Caleb's absence, and the relief that had rushed through her at his return, feelings too large and too insistent to belong to mere friendliness toward a good customer. She closed the box gently and set it back beneath her table, and for a while neither woman spoke, the market noise filling the space between them. "I'm not telling you this to trouble you," the old woman said finally. "I'm telling you because I watched a man's pride and my own keep two hearts apart for 40 years, and I don't imagine either one of us ever stopped wondering what we'd traded away for it." She looked at Addie steadily. "That man of yours has been buying more bread than any sensible bachelor needs for the better part of a year, and every soul in this market knows why, but him and you. Don't let pride write you a box of letters you never send Addie Freeman." She had come to the church on a Tuesday afternoon to help arrange flowers for the following Sunday's service, a small task she'd taken on since her mother's passing, and found the Reverend in his study sorting through a drawer of old correspondence he'd been meaning to clear out for years. He was a practical man, given to plain speech, and when Addie asked idly what he was searching for, he answered without much thought to the weight of what he was saying. That evening, watching Nathaniel chase fireflies in the last of the daylight, she found herself wondering for the first time without flinching from the thought what Caleb Whitfield might say if she ever asked him plainly why he bought so much bread. She did not yet have the courage to ask. But she no longer told herself the question didn't matter. It was Reverend Whitcomb, of all people, who finally gave Addie the missing piece, not by design, but by the accident of a conversation meant for someone else entirely. He was engaged once before he came to Millbrook. A young woman back in Nebraska, Sarah Combs, if I recall the name right. They were to be married that spring. She wrote him a letter 3 weeks before the wedding, calling it off. Said she'd found she wanted a different kind of life than a rancher could give her. Wanted the city, wanted a husband who'd take her there. He shook his head slowly. Caleb never spoke of it to me directly, but he brought me the letter she'd sent, breaking it off not long after he arrived here, and asked me to keep it somewhere he wouldn't have to look at it. Said he didn't trust himself not to read it over till he'd worn a hole clean through it. "An old letter of Caleb Whitfield's," he said, still rifling through the drawer. "He gave it to me to hold, must be 4 years past now, and asked me never to return it to him. Been meaning to finally throw the thing out, though something in me's never quite managed it." "A letter?" Addie asked, careful to keep her voice light. The Reverend glanced up, perhaps only then remembering himself. "You'll have heard the story, surely. Most everyone in town has one version or another." When Addie shook her head, he seemed to weigh whether it was his place to say more, then sighed the way men of God sometimes do when deciding a kindness is worth a small breach of discretion. Addie walked home that afternoon, turning the story over with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel. She understood suddenly and completely why a man might buy bread he didn't need, rather than risk asking outright for something he wanted. Why he might tell himself week after week that 30 seconds and a coin left uncollected was the whole of what he was allowed. Addie sat very still, the flowers in her lap forgotten. She thought of Caleb's careful silences, his unhurried patience, the way he never once in nearly a year of Thursdays had said a single word that might be mistaken for courtship. She had thought it simple reticence, a quiet man's natural reserve. She understood now it was something heavier, a wound kept as carefully hidden as her own. He's never so much as looked twice at another woman since he came to town. The Reverend went on, unaware of how closely Addie was listening now. "Folks used to say he'd never marry at all. I confess I'd started to believe it myself until this past year." He gave her a look then that was not entirely without knowing in it, though he said nothing further, and returned his attention to the drawer. Word travels fast in a town the size of Millbrook, and by the following week it had reached Caleb Whitfield, the way most things reached him second-hand, over the counter of the mercantile, delivered without malice by a man who saw everything and kept little of it to himself. That evening she did not look at Caleb Whitfield, as a strange, quiet man who bought too much bread. She looked at him in her own mind's eye as someone who understood exactly what it cost to keep a heart carefully guarded and exactly how much courage it might take to finally set that guard down. She did not know yet what she meant to do with that understanding, but she found for the first time that she wanted to do something with it at all. She thought of her own careful armor built brick by brick since Thomas had been carried out of the mine, the way she'd told herself steadiness was enough, that she needed no one that wanting, was a door better left closed. She had thought her own caution a private thing born of her own particular grief. She saw now that Caleb carried the very same weight dressed in different cloth. He told himself this several times. It did not make the stone any lighter. That Thursday, for the first time in 11 months, Caleb did not ride into Millbrook. Garrity set on asking Mrs. Freeman formal. Silas Pruitt told him weighing out nails with the unhurried air of a man passing along mere gossip. Heard it from his own hired hand. Reckon he means to make it official before the month's out. Caleb paid for his goods and said nothing the way he said nothing about most things that mattered to him. But the words settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward long after the moment itself had passed. He told himself riding home that evening that it changed nothing. He had never spoken a word of courtship to Addie Freeman. He had never given her cause to expect anything from him beyond a nickel a penny and the quiet, ordinary transaction of bread bought and bread sold. He had no claim on her attention, no right to feel the particular cold weight now sitting behind his ribs. A man could not begrudge another man for asking plainly for what he himself had never found the courage to ask. In Millbrook, Addie noticed the empty hitching post, again noticed it the moment the church bell tolled the market's opening hour, and felt something sink in her more sharply than it had the first time he'd stayed away. She told herself this time was different, that a man recovering from a sick herd might reasonably need a second week to catch his affairs back up. But some quieter part of her did not believe the reasoning, even as she offered it to herself. He told himself it was practical, there was fence line needing mending on the east pasture, and the mare that had come through her fever still needed watching. These things were true enough, but the deeper truth one he did not examine too closely was that he could not bring himself to stand at that familiar counter and set down his coin, knowing that soon enough there would be a ring on her hand, and a different man's name she'd say each morning instead of his own. He worked the fence line until his hands ached and the light failed, and told himself the ache in his chest was simple tiredness. Addie set down her fork. She had known in some careful, guarded corner of herself that the town's talk moved faster than her own decisions did. But hearing it now from her own son's untroubled mouth, she understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity what Caleb must have heard as well, and why a man who had spent 11 months finding quiet, careful reasons to see her might suddenly find none at all. It was Nathaniel, predictably unguarded, in the way only a 6-year-old could be, who gave voice to what his mother would not. "Where's Mr. Caleb?" he asked that evening, poking at his supper with more interest in the question than the food. "He wasn't at the market again. He's likely busy with his ranch, love. He's always busy with his ranch. He still comes." Nathaniel frowned, working through the puzzle with the plain logic of a child. "Did you tell him about Mr. Garrity?" Addie went very still. "Why would I need to tell him that—" Nathaniel shrugged, already losing interest, reaching for biscuit under the table. "Louise said Mr. Garrity was going to ask you to marry him. I heard her tell Widow Hutchins." That night, she did not sleep. She sat instead at her kitchen table with her account ledger open before her, though she had no head for numbers just then. Her eyes kept drifting instead to the drawer beneath the counter, where she kept her correspondence empty of any letter she had ever written and never sent, and she found herself thinking with a fierce and sudden clarity that she did not intend to become Widow Hutchins, an old woman with a box of words too late to matter. She sat with her son a long while after supper, saying little, her mind turning over everything Widow Hutchins had told her. Everything the Reverend had let slip, everything she herself had spent weeks refusing to name plainly. She thought of a letter from Nebraska kept unread in a drawer for 4 years. She thought of a man who bought bread he didn't need because 30 seconds of an ordinary greeting was the only courtship he'd allowed himself to risk. She understood finally, and without any further hedging, that if she did not do something herself, the two of them might simply go on this way, circling each other in careful silence, until one day there was nothing left to circle at all. 61 loaves since the previous spring. 61 Thursdays, near enough, with only the 2 recent weeks missing from the count. She stared at the number a long while, the ink faintly smudged where her own hand had pressed too hard against the page in the early months before she'd let herself notice what she was recording. The end-of-season accounts came due the following week, and Addie spent a full evening bent over her ledger by lamplight, tallying the year's business the way her mother had taught her, every sale recorded, every column summed twice to catch her own mistakes. It was tedious, necessary work, the kind that asked nothing of her but patience and a steady hand. She had nearly finished when her eye caught, almost by accident, the running total beneath Caleb Whitfield's name, a column she had kept faithfully, without ever once adding it up in full. She sat back in her chair, candle guttering low, and did the sum properly for the first time. She closed the ledger, blew out the candle, and sat a long moment in the dark, feeling something in her chest settle into a decision she had been circling for weeks, without quite landing on it. The next morning, she left Nathaniel with Louise. "Just an errand," she said, and did not explain further, though Louise's knowing look suggested no explanation was needed, and walked the road out toward the Whitfield ranch before she could talk herself out of it. She thought of Widow Hutchins' box of unsent letters kept 40 years in a wooden chest, because pride had once seemed a truer thing than a hope of speaking first. She thought of Caleb's letter from Nebraska kept unread for 4 years, in a drawer he could not bring himself to empty. She thought of her own 3 years of careful armor, built so high and so steady that she had nearly let a good man's absence go unremarked, rather than admit what it meant to her. No bachelor ate 61 loaves of bread in a year. No sensible man spent that many Thursday mornings and that many uncollected pennies on a habit that served no purpose beyond hunger. She had known this in some quiet corner of herself for weeks now. Louise had told her plainly enough, and Widow Hutchins, and even her own son. But seeing it laid out in her own careful handwriting, undeniable as arithmetic, something in her finally gave way. He set down the fence tool in his hand, giving her his full attention in the quiet, unhurried way she'd come to recognize as entirely his own. "All right. 61 loaves," she said, "since last spring. I added the column myself last night, so don't tell me your hired hands have taken to eating my bread, because I know for a fact they don't care for the crust, the way you always ask me to cut it." She found Caleb in the near pasture, checking the mended fence line, his sleeves rolled and his hat pushed back from his forehead in the late morning sun. He straightened at the sound of her approach, and something crossed his face that was equal parts surprise and a wariness she recognized now for what it was, the same careful guardedness she'd worn herself for 3 long years. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, formal, in a way he hadn't been since their first Thursdays together, the distance in it deliberate. "Something wrong at the stall?" "No," she said, and found her voice steadier than she'd expected it to be now that she'd finally committed herself to the walking. "I came to ask you something, and I'd be obliged if you'd answer it plainly, the way you answer most things." "I heard about Garrity," he said finally low, not quite meeting her eyes. "Heard he means to ask you proper. Figured it wasn't my place to keep coming round once that happened. Figured I'd already taken more than my share of your Thursdays as it was. Something flickered across his face, caught out plainly, and for the first time since she'd known him, unable to hide behind silence. He looked away toward the pasture, his jaw working, and for a long moment she thought he might simply refuse to answer at all. Retreat back into the careful reserve he'd worn like armor for as long as she'd known him. "Caleb," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of Mr. attached to it. And she watched it land on him the way her own name in his voice had always landed on her, like something he hadn't quite let himself hope to hear. "I know," Addie said gentler now. "I've heard the story about Nebraska." He flinched slightly at that, but didn't look away. "Then you know why I never said anything more than good morning, and your change however many years I let that go on." "I do," she said, "and I've decided I don't much care for either of us going on that way any longer." "You never took anything I didn't want to give," Addie said. "That's rather the trouble, Caleb Whitfield. You never took anything at all. You just kept buying bread and leaving pennies and letting a whole year go by without once asking me for what you actually wanted." He looked at her, then finally something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes that she had never once seen there before, not in 11 months of careful Thursdays, not even the day he'd coaxed a frightened dog from a woodpile with nothing but patience and an open hand. "I don't rightly know how to ask for things anymore," he admitted quiet. "Got out of the habit some years back. Learned it costs less to want quietly than to ask plain and be told no." Caleb reached into his coat pocket, his hand not quite steady, and drew out something small wrapped in a worn scrap of cloth. He held it out to her without a word. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a nickel and a penny, the very coins she realized from that very first Thursday, nearly a year past, kept all this time instead of spent. Caleb stood very still in the middle of his own pasture, the fence tool forgotten at his feet, looking at Addie as though he could not quite trust what he'd just heard her say. "I've turned Emmett Garrity down," she said, before he could find words of his own. "Told him last night I couldn't accept his offer, and that it wasn't fair of me to keep him waiting on an answer any longer when my own heart had already made its choice some months back, whether I'd let myself admit it or not." "Addie, I'm not finished," she said, though not unkindly, and he fell silent, watching her with the same careful attention he'd once given a frightened dog wedged into a woodpile, as though any wrong movement might send the whole moment skittering away from him. "I spent 3 years telling myself steadiness was enough, that I didn't need anyone that wanting was a door better left shut, because I'd already had it taken from me once and didn't trust myself to survive it a second time." She took a breath, steadying herself. "And then a quiet rancher started buying more bread than any sensible man needed, and leaving pennies he never meant to be paid back for, and being patient with my son in a way I hadn't seen from anyone since his own father died. And somewhere in all those Thursdays, I stopped being quite so certain that steadiness alone was the whole of what I wanted from a life." "I've loved you the better part of a year, Addie Freeman," he said. "Loved the way you say my name like it costs you nothing, when I know full well it costs me everything to hear it. Loved your boy like he was already mine to look after. I'm not a man with much talent for pretty words, and I've got a ranch that keeps me busier than any woman ought to have to compete with. But I'd like the chance to ask for you properly, to call on you, to build something with you, not just buy bread, and hope the wanting stayed quiet enough not to show." He paused, and for the first time she saw something like fear cross his weathered face. "I'd like to marry you, if you'll have a man who took near on a year just to say so. I told myself I was keeping the change to give back to you someday, if I ever worked up the nerve to ask for something more than bread," he said, his voice low and rough with an honesty she'd never heard him use before. Told myself that for 11 months, Addie. Truth is, I just wanted something of yours to carry, since I never let myself carry the courage to ask for the rest of it. Ask for it now, she said, and her voice was steady even as her heart was not. He looked at her a long moment, and she watched him gather himself, the way she imagined he gathered himself before breaking a green horse to the saddle. Slow, deliberate, no room left for retreat. They were married that autumn, in the same small church where he had bought his careful silences, and she had sold her patient bread, and where Widow Hutchins wept openly through the whole ceremony, clutching a wooden box of old letters she had finally that same week decided to burn. The wind moved through the pasture grass, and somewhere behind them, one of the horses stamped and blew, and Addie Freeman found she did not need nearly so long to answer as he had needed to ask. Yes, she said simply, and watched 11 months of careful restraint break open across his face all at once. Obviously, yes, Caleb Whitfield. I've been hoping you'd finally get round to asking. He crossed the small distance between them then, and took her hand in his, same hand that had once trembled setting down a nickel and a penny, steady now, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further at all, because nothing further needed saying. Nathaniel stood beside them at the front of the church, solemn, with the importance of his task, holding a small cushion with 2 coins tied to it, instead of a ring, a nickel, and a penny. The very ones Caleb had carried a year in his coat pocket, now exchanged one final time between the 2 people who had needed the whole of a year to understand what they'd always meant. Caleb Whitfield never did stop buying bread from his wife's stall, though the nickel and penny were retired to a small box on their mantel, kept the way some men keep a medal or a photograph, proof of a year spent learning that the bravest thing a quiet man could do wasn't staying silent forever, but finally plainly asking.
That's the thing about love that starts small. It rarely announces itself with grand declarations or sudden lighting. It starts with a coin left uncollected, a name set gently across a counter, a year of quiet Thursday. That means far more than either heart is willing to admit out loud. Caleb and Addie didn't fall in love at once. They built it, love by love, penny by penny, until one day the ordinary act of buying bread had quietly become the whole shape of a life neither of them was willing to live without. If you were watching from somewhere in the world tonight, I would love to know, where are you turning in from? Rub your city and stay in the comment below. It always warms my heart to see how far this story traveled. If this one found its way into your evening the way I hope it did, give it a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already. There's another quiet story just like this one waiting for you soon. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of each other.